Welcome everybody to another fabulous panel here at D4. Thank you so much for joining us for our digital game design, creating tabletop games in a digital space. My name is Suzanne Sheldon, and I will be your host and moderator for this panel. I'm so excited that you're here. I'm excited to be here. You might know me from my work with the Tabletop Network, the Dice Tower, where I've extensively covered board game apps, Kickstarters, and whatnot. And I am currently one of the 4 co-hosts of the flagship Dice Tower podcast as well. I am so lucky to be joined by this illustrious panel of experts in our digital analog meshing world. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Let's just start right up there with you, Fertessa.
All right. Hi, I am Fertessa Allyse, and I'm a game designer currently in Seattle. I am a game producer for Funko Games, and you'll see my games Book of Villainy, Mansplaining, which I co-designed, and Wicked and Wise. So that's me.
Thank you so much for being here. Mark, how about you?
Hi, everyone. My name is Mark. I'm the community manager for Tabletopia. We're an online platform for digital board games, over 1,700 now, so catalog keeps on growing. And I'm also the co-founder of Ludocherry, which is a geeky fashion line.
Amazing clothes. I love them so much.
Oh, thank you.
Amber, tell us about yourself.
Oh, I'm Amber Cook. I am the marketing director for Roll20 currently. I have worked in board games and a little bit of the digital space for tabletop for about 15 years now. And what else do I do? I've got a blog called the 100 Games Project. I'm on the American Tabletop Awards and spend a lot of time online with games.
That is truer facts, can't be told. And finally, last but not least, Jeff.
Hey, I'm Geoffrey Zatkin. I am the creative director of Experiment 7, which is a company that makes virtual reality board games. We've done several licenses, including Settlers of Catan. I have 20 years as a video game designer. My first big game was EverQuest a very long time ago. And I'm also the studio director of the YouTube channel Extra Credits, which among other things covers videos on video games, society, culture, and all sorts of other fun stuff.
Thank you so much for being here and bringing all of your expertise to this panel. I appreciate you being here. Let's just jump right in. And I thought it would be really fun to start off talking about our personal preferences or experiences with a digital tabletop experience, whether it's an app that you like to play or a site that you like to use or an experience that you had as a game tester. Does anybody have kind of a compelling story about that blend of analog and digital that you'd like to share?
Sure. For me, it's actually a really nostalgic thing, my relationship with digital gaming, because I grew up an only child, and often, there weren't solo games in the mass market, and I could only play games with myself. So whenever they started putting like Monopoly on the PlayStation and, these video game consoles, that was my first introduction to board games in a virtual format. And I found as I grew older that that relationship still existed even when I found people to play board games with, because particularly when the pandemic hit, I'm a game designer and I couldn't get my game physically in front of people anymore because of socially distancing. But what happened was really amazing because a lot of board game designers moved to digital play testing and created communities around it. So I got into Tabletop Simulator, though there's also Tabletopia, and that became a whole different sort of a revolution. On top of being able to game socially, I also used Board Game Arena. So again, in situations where I'm not able to physically be with people, I found that digital board gaming has been very important.
For me as well.
I think that my favorite was Ticket to Ride. That was sort of like the defining digital board game experience for me and sold me on the idea. I mean, as a marketer, it sold me on the idea of digital as a marketing tool for tabletop games and for sort of evangelism. But yeah, Ticket to Ride and then being able to play Splendor was like my that just it made my heart real happy. And I moved cross country. In the middle of moving cross country, I was able to play Splendor a lot with my family back home, or my partner who was on the opposite side of the country. And so, we would often just like Skype and play nerdy board games together. And it kept me socialized a lot of the time. And that was, pre-pandemic. And that was, 5-6 years ago now.
One of the apps that I got really obsessed with a couple of years ago was the Gunch on Clever app. And I think everyone in tabletop kind of just like fell into that rabbit hole of, can I get to 300? Can I get to 305? Because, and really just like pushing each other to beat the high scores. And I thought that was such a really cool way that everyone was engaging with the same game. And plus, like, the decisions are so simple. You just like roll the dice. Which one do I want? That one. Great. And then move on. And like, I really like that I got to play the game a lot, but also share stories about it with other people.
I never hit 300.
Oh no.
No, I'm so bad at that game, but I love it so much.
It's so much fun. There's a third one coming out soon.
Oh
Ooh.
no, my time. Goodbye.
Yeah.
Time.
I think one of my favorites, it's funny, you always hear about, because I've been making video games for a long time, but I started with board games. It was D&D and Battletech and Car Wars and Axis and Allies and Risk and Monopoly, and just everything I could find I would play. And I was a self-taught game designer because there weren't game design schools then, and it was all from playing board games and then taking them and modding them and slowly learn how to do digital versions of it. And I did those for a really long time, but was still playing D&D and everything with friends. And then a couple of years ago when I got into VR, saying, what's the killer app of VR? It's bringing people together. Presence is probably the single most spectacular part of VR. So being able to bring people into virtual rooms to hang out with avatars and positional sound and feel like they were next to each other, recreating the old high school and college days with people you'll never all get back in the same room again, kind of rekindled my love of board games. And just, it's kept going. And during the pandemic, just kit bashing everything. It's like, okay, D&D Beyond and Roll20 and Fantasy Grounds, it's like just bringing everything in together to play. I'm actually playing D&D now with old college friends I haven't seen in person for like 25 years because, hey, it's the pandemic and we can't, since you don't have to play local anymore, might as well bring everybody back together. We lost a character today. His mind got eaten by a mind flayer. It was great.
I hate it when that happens.
It's the worst.
I mean, it's great, but it's awful. But, we're all just like, oh.
One of my favorite stories that came up, just working at Roll20 now, I get to hear so many stories like that of people who used to play together and now playing together again, especially in the last year, when people were looking for ways to socialize online and maybe like something super active like Jackbox isn't it, or just sitting here on Zoom, unstructured might not be it, but I think D&D or, an indie RPG or one shot might be a really nice in-between for socialization. My favorite story that I heard was a mom who wrote into us to say that she was raising her kids and she and her husband would run weekly like D&D sessions for them. And during the pandemic, like all her children are grown now, and now the kids are running D&D sessions for like the rest of the family, and they're doing it all in Roll20, which just made my entire heart happy.
That's
like intergenerational D&D.
That's incredibly cool.
Yeah.
I think that obviously having a global pandemic has definitely pushed people into discovering new ways of gaming, right? Because people want to play and people want to connect, and the digital options out there have been so valuable. And I think that that's a really obvious benefit of where digital games are. But I'd love to hear from your perspectives, because we really have a broad range of experience. What are maybe some other elements of digitizing an analog, what is traditionally an analog experience? What are some of the other benefits, whether you're a player or a designer or a technologist, that kind of adding that technology element to an analog experience brings to us as a community?
I mean, I've always the thing that I keep seeing again and again is that people get to play games they would never get to touch otherwise. It's like a library at a game con that's just always open, and especially Kickstarter games. It's a real opportunity to like kind of try before you buy. a version of a game that doesn't even exist yet. But you can play through the rule set rather than just reading the PDF of the rules. You actually get the chance to see if it's for you. And I think that's one of the really cool benefits of digital. It's a cheap way, an easy way to get at least a demo version of a game into players' hands.
I really like the digital aspect, actually the community aspect, because playing again with, being older, having kids, having things, there's no way, like one of the original reasons we made EverQuest so long ago was people could only get together once a week to play D&D. We're like, hey, we're going to make an online thing you can always play and meet new friends. And looking at the tools now where you can go play online and hop on Discord, and it's like, oh, somebody's kid is crying in the background. They can just hit mute, deal with it. These are things you can't really do on a board game night, or, not everybody has to go get babysitters. It's bringing a lot more freedom to play for a lot more people in a lot more structure, in a lot more ways. And I love that it's opening that up in ways that we didn't used to have as much.
Yeah, we're working to even, one of the projects that I'm working on is a mobile app for Roll20, where we're even sort of taking it a step further than that. It's like, oh, you can't actually be at your laptop right now. You need to be rolling from like with your AirPods in, and you're like, putting your kid to bed or whatever, and you can hit your saving throw from your phone app, and just keep that moving while you're doing the dishes, doing whatever it is that you're doing, so you can stay engaged in the game, even if it's not like actively your turn. And I think that we're going to find that people just find more and more ways to connect, the easier we make it for them.
I agree with all of those points. And I think to me, the biggest thing about digital gaming is its accessibility on multiple levels, because as people mentioned, one, it gets rid of barriers, financial barriers, because some people can't afford to try the new game or afford to travel to a convention to try a new game. And then there's also the barrier of time and availability for people with families, people who can't easily leave their homes. I know for me, I would never have met half the people, not even a third of the people that I've met online. There's some people from the UK that I have socialized with, people that are across the country. I've met so many designers in Seattle before I moved to Seattle, where in Georgia, the gaming space was a lot smaller. And suddenly with digital gaming, my bubble just grew. So as a game player, it became a lot more accessible, being able to play these games and learn these games and socialize with people. And as a game designer, it became a lot more accessible, because instead of having to go to my local, home Office Depot and printing a game off for $20 each time, I can make these digital iterations over and over and over again. And it smoothed out that process and made it easier to, or financially feasible to experiment and, just take risks. So that's great.
Fertessa, one of the really cool things I've also seen designers doing is that digital versions, apart from like the sort of speed of iteration you can do, it also widens the net of playtesters you have access to. So you can just put a call out on Twitter and say, "Hey, do my fans want to try the game?" And then you've got feedback from 200 people instead of like the 5 people at your local meetup, which I think is really cool.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I have had a much greater rate and consistent rate of playtesting than I did in person. And also, I meant to say, I'm an introvert. So even if I had gone to a convention in the UK or across the country, that doesn't mean I would have met the people or talked to them. I would have sat at a table and I would have waited quietly and hoped somebody sat down for a game with me. But because of these digital communities where people sign up and say, I want to play this game, this is the game that I want people to play, and we just, agree on these things, that just revolutionized how I was able to network and connect with people. So that was great for me, all things considered.
Really
I wonder too if there aren't more indie games being made, because just in the same way that you're finding these people to connect with, like from a game designer perspective and playtester perspective, especially in the RPG space, there's things like Itch, where there's just like so many really specific like Carly Rae Jepsen game things that are happening. Like, I mean, there's just like crazy stuff out there that you hear about people playing. And I think it's really fun when that stuff finds its audience, and maybe the audience isn't huge and they wouldn't have funded an entire print run, but because we're playing online, even if it's just the PDF that's available, if you give people the platform to connect, they're able to, like, some of these games are getting legs that they might not have so easily found if we were strictly analog.
Democratizing distribution.
Yeah, I love that. I think part of like even what D4 is about, right, is spreading the love of games, of this world of gaming. And certainly, while so much of it is focused on the physical experience of it, obviously we're here because this digital element has so many benefits to it. I love that we're talking about accessibility and kind of the growth of the hobby overall. And I think that that's amazing points. I will say, though, I've been, gaming for a long time, and I have noticed that there is a subset of gaming fans, of board game and analog and tabletop game fans, that are often maybe a little resistant to technology coming into their lovely paper and cardboard and plastic and wood worlds. And I can understand that on some point. Obviously, I'm a pretty big proponent of technology integrating and kind of adopting it as part of the world. But I'd love to hear from the experts here, maybe some thoughts around what are some of the challenges in implementing what is originally an analog experience, not just the rules and the mechanisms, which I know there are tons of challenges there too, but what are some of the things that you think about as a challenge that you have to work to overcome or address to give folks that experience, to maintain what they love about tabletop games while they're in front of a screen of some sort?
I think for me, one thing that you have to be careful about is exclusion. So whenever you are adding, say, a digital component to a game, is it dependent on internet? Will a person be unable to play it if they can't access the digital part? Because some people I've seen in discussions want to make their rules digital and not have a physical copy, and that can be, that can exclude a person and make it more difficult to play your game. And then also, whenever it came to like digital play testing, you had to be aware of the people essentially across from you without being able to see them. So being aware that, they have lives going on outside of what's happening on the screen. They may have children crying that they have to attend to, or, having to be emotionally aware of a person without being able to see them, and still treat them as a social interaction rather than just only focusing on the gameplay in front of you.
That's actually
and one thing you need to be careful. One thing you need to be careful of is that poor implementations of games don't actually have players fighting the controls rather than actually playing the game. You want to make sure that the game itself is done in a way that allows the players to just enjoy the experience over actually, trying to drag pieces all over a screen and not actually enjoying themselves.
And actually, just backing up what Fertessa was saying, just in a physical location, you can look across the table. You can read somebody's body language. You can see how they're feeling. It's a lot easier than in a digital place with much less feedback. And that can be it can make it harder to build community in some cases. It can also make it, in some cases, a less enjoyable game, because part of the fun is sitting around with people. And that's one of the tricks on transitioning it from analog to digital, is figuring out what can you do to substitute in or to hack in pieces of what would have been the physical component of the game. The other one in digital, as much as it's a strength, it's also a weakness, the fact that people aren't semi-monotasking. If you're all sitting around the table, you're all concentrating on the same thing. If you're not, you may be doing, sitting around, reading your email, doing a couple of other things. There isn't always the same focus, and that can also detract from the game.
I mean, I'm
love
playing
one of the
Minesweeper right now, so
I love one of the things that that actually we talked about, Jeff, when we were working in Catan VR, which was like, it was such a unique thing for me to hear about a digital gaming experience, or at least from a tabletop perspective. When we were making it, we were talking about like, oh, there's actually, this is one of the things that excited me the most. People can come and just hang out in this room while other people are playing Catan VR, and they don't have to be at the table. So imagine you're at a convention, you know, there's always people who kind of walk by. And that's the thing that's like a little bit, you know, like there's that sort of rhythm of, you can tell people are wrapping up a game and you might stay and wait and just see if you're going to sort of double dutch in, right? Like, and there's that, you can't do that quite as easily. So I think it's a little, you know, that's, and then also just the socialization around the game, because if we're hanging out in my living room, I can decide to take a break for 15 minutes while you all play like some quick filler game. But how am I socializing and staying engaged with the group so that I know when we're coming back in for the next round? And I just thought about those like sort of sofa areas, those sort of seating areas in Catan VR that aren't at the table. And I loved that it was thoughtful for those people, right?
We measured so much real life furniture to be able to build in like actual space in that. Yeah. The human brain's weird. You can look at a thing and you're like, that doesn't feel right. And you don't realize it's like, oh, the chairs are a foot further away from the table than they actually would be, or just other things like that, because humans are so used to interaction. But that's a very VR specific problem, but it was also, you know, that's fun stuff to work on.
I'd love to kind of dig a little deeper there when you're talking, because I think it's interesting for people who are exploring digital games, or maybe have a little, you know, resistance around that, to understand the kind of thought process and work that goes into enhancing these experiences. So I'd love to dig in a little bit on kind of, you've talked about the challenges of bringing that paper experience there, making people feel connected, or that socialization issue. What are some of the tactics that you use to try to overcome those challenges?
Oh, data. The fun thing that I love about digital is that we have data. Sometimes we have way too much data, but when you're making a board game, you get to do it in such isolation in some ways. Like, right, might say that you're going to have X number of play tests and X number of blind play tests. And with digital, there's just this ability to, well, I mean, depending on like the quality of what the team you're working with, right, and your sort of standards, right, you can be doing a lot of A/B testing, you can be doing feature flagging, you can roll things out to certain subsets of users to try things out. And that's one of the things that I've really enjoyed experiencing the last couple of years at Roll20, is we hit such a crazy growth point that suddenly there's just a huge amount of infrastructure work that's happened in the last year, so that we're running things instead of like a little tiny startup that's a few friends who wanted to keep playing D&D together after college. It's like, oh, we're like a real, like, you know, digital software company that professionally is making decisions. And yeah, that to me just is such a world of difference, and improves the quality for everybody.
I think as far as game design is concerned, something that I found myself concentrating more on has been the user interface of my game. So people are able to zoom over cards and look at them, you know, right in their face. And so it becomes a little bit more obvious if there's some lackluster graphic design that makes it harder to read, especially when people are looking at it through a screen rather than, you know, physically in their hand. It's, I think, a lot less forgiving. So figuring out how to order things so that they don't make your brain scream more than it already is from like trying to use a digital interface when that's not necessarily what you're used to, is what I work on. And that's you know, a trial and error sort of thing, but really focusing on that user interface and making it as easy as possible for people to access my game and learn it has been my focus with digital playtesting. Because it's already, again, a barrier to try and learn a new program in order to even play a game. And, you know, on top of using your time to play a game that might be broken. So, you know, I just try and make it easier on their end to at least intake it.
Yeah. There's a lot of intentionality that goes into it from the design side too. And that, so I've been a video game designer for a very long time. Board games and transitions, I think, are some of the most complex for both the UI and the UX, the user experience part of it, because you're having to design all aspects of it, and it has to be intuitive. And one of the things about board games is often, you know, if you're going and playing a shooter game, a popular shooter game, they've focused it down to the shooting experience. You know, there's only a couple of things you're interacting with at every point along the way. Board games almost have the opposite. It's lots of small pieces and cards and all of these different elements. It's a very different experience than trying to design a very focused game, because you're designing something that has a lot more interactable elements because of the legacy of where it came from. And so figuring out how to do that well, you have to be both a good designer and somebody who's good at the interface and the experience of how it all interacts together. So it's actually, in some cases, a more demanding set of skills and a more demanding set of intentionality of what are you thinking about, how do you do it, because of just the sheer number of moving pieces of what we're coming from.
And because there's so many moving bits in a board game, one thing I found that sometimes gets lost in the shuffle, and is a very a difficult balance to strike, is that when you implement automation to try and take care of a lot of sort of the upkeep or like shuffling cards or dealing things out, that can speed things up. But there's also, the player needs to understand why some of that automation is happening. If they really, yeah, exactly. It's like, why did I get 5 cards instead of 4 this time? Because you might know the rules, or it might be trying to do a tutorial or something. And unless you have the actual context of why something is happening, I feel like a lot of board game players who are used to knowing every little bit meticulously get very lost in that. Myself, personally, that's definitely happened a few times with digital versions of games.
Yeah. Me as well. And I've actually had the experience where I've played a board game in the digital space first, and I had a great time, liked the game, bought the game, and then had to relearn the whole thing because it wasn't set up for me. And I had to do everything myself. And well, that was garbage. Come on. Like, I don't want to do work. Pay for automation.
When it's done really well, I think some digital versions are actually better than the physical versions. Especially on even just things like setup, tear down.
Oni Rim. That's one of the ones that's just like, gosh. To me, it's like, you just want to play that as an app.
So much shuffling.
Yeah,
100%.
Yeah.
Or no, I think that's a great point. Or anything, yeah.
And I think that brings up an interesting point, Jeff, is one of the things that I have also heard are, and even from kind of traditional analog game publishers, I've heard this concern that putting their game into a digital space will negatively impact them financially. And, you know, I've looked into this a little myself, and I kind of lean on there's no actual evidence that digitizing a board game experience harms physical sales. But I mean, you all are here, and this is your space that you play in. I'd love to hear whether you've seen that either direction, and if there are any other risks that are kind of top of mind as we're looking at integrating technology into our formerly only analog world that you are kind of worried about or considering in today's time.
I think that the digital is actually very complementary to the physical game, because if I'm choosing not to buy a game, like, there is a financial barrier, yes, but it could be because of the player count. Like, maybe I can only physically play it with 2 people and it's great as a 4-player game. But, you know, if I know somebody who hosts 4-player parties, I'm going to say, you should really get this game, and then we can all play it. So I feel like while that is definitely a concern, the physical copy, if I love a game, I'm going to want to buy it, or I'm going to want to recommend it to people to buy. Kind of similar to how if a publisher loves a game but they don't necessarily want to publish it, they'll recommend it to another publisher to snatch up that game designer. So I feel like that's very similar.
Because I sort of spend my time on the social media side of interacting with our audience, a lot of what I see are people being like, "Oh, I bought this game after I got to try it on Tabletopia," or "This gave me a chance to demo it. I think I will go and back it." And so I think and obviously those people are going to speak up because they've had a positive experience. If someone is going to walk away from a game, they're not going to go tweeting, you know what? No, I'm not going to buy it after I played this. But I've constantly seen a lot of people really resonating with the digital versions of the game, and then that translating directly into sales or backs. And I think it's only a positive thing.
Mark, do you think that that's filling the need of almost the hobby shop or the game store, where people would wander into a game store, see other people playing it, maybe sit down and be like, oh, I want to buy a copy of this?
I definitely think it's sort of accomplishing the same sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I love my friendly local game store as much as anybody when we are able to safely be in there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, those spaces do a lot of other things as well, like events and, a personal recommendation as well. But I definitely think that with content creators in the board game space, a lot of them are talking about games. And then if someone's able to go try that game digitally, it's a lot better of a gateway in, I think, than just going to the publisher's website and reading about it.
Less friction.
I stand pretty firmly rooted in that, like, these games definitely are marketing arms of the board games. And I think that it really just depends on, one of the things that, unfortunately, marketing tends to be kind of immature in the tabletop space a lot of the time. And so I don't think that we're often thinking about, when we're talking about what is the experience when you move something from analog to digital, and what are the differences there. Some of the things that are really delightful about the physical experience are not the same things that are going to be delightful about the digital experience. Like, I would really love to play Quacks of Quedlinburg all night long and just click clack those little pieces that I've upgraded with BGG pieces, and I could just do that forever and be really happy. And I'm not going to want to play that game in the digital space. That's just not the thing. And I think it's specific to each different game, but it's also specific to when the digital version comes out. If you're using it in the way that I'm sure a lot of people are using Tabletopia and Tabletop Simulator, and Fertessa as a game designer is using things to like test and help build an audience before a game goes to launch, I think you're giving people the opportunity to have that demo and do something similar to what a local game store can do in those like high touch demos. I learned to play Monstrosity from Eric Slauson and Deepwater Games because Eric was nice enough to hop on Zoom and teach us how to play one night. And from there, I was like, well, I want to put this on Roll20. So we put it on Roll20 last week. And, and I think that I believe that the more people that play that on Roll20 are going to go and buy the physical copy. But then I think, oh gosh, I'm forgetting the name of the game. There is Potion Explosion that was released from Asmodee Digital, which was a really fun, like, hey, we're bringing a match 3 game to board games. It's like an app became a board game, has now become an app again. And that one, is it selling more copies of the physical one? I don't know. And I'd love to see better data from board game companies who are really heavily invested in apps, but it's so hard to isolate that, because sometimes you're investing $5,000 in the development of an app and it's just somebody's like hobby. And sometimes you're investing $500,000 or $1 million in an app, and I expect them to have a different impact and be designed to have a different impact on the physical sales, right?
It actually makes me think that the app itself also has another job, like you said, with marketing, and that it lives longer, because if your local game store runs out or it's never on the shelf, then it may not come across people, but people that are in the digital space will come across a game and suddenly it has new life again. And then there is demand for the physical copy somewhere else. So I think it has that possibility as well.
Interesting. Certainly one of the concerns I frequently hear in the community as well, though, actually is about longevity and about sustainability of any individual game or app that people have had. They're like, okay, well, what happens if the developer goes out of business? If I buy a board game, I have this box that I can keep and hold and snuggle with and, tuck in at night. And if I buy an app and, is it vaporware after a year or after 2 years?
It's also $3 and not $35. And that's a whole nother story, right? Like the valuation of digital board games versus the physical counterparts is like, do you care if you do you care if it's not sustained after
some
3 years?
People really do. Like, we still have people years in, like So at this point, we've put Catan VR onto 8 different pieces of VR hardware. And we were lucky enough to be #1 seller on 7 of them. So, I mean, it's been really well received, but VR hardware keeps getting deprecated because the companies come out with new stuff. And so we have people who bought things on hardware that just, the VR company has literally said, we have not made this or sold anything on it for 2 years. And, we try and update those ones as best we can, but it's really hard in some cases. Or, if Apple comes and does an iOS update and you're like, hey, sorry, you have to come, unless you do this thing, you can no longer log into your Apple ID through the game. If the game's been out for a couple of years, the developer may not even be in a place where they can do an update on that with everything that Apple will require on the SDK patches to be able, I mean, there's a whole bunch of legacy in there that can make it very hard to do updates through nothing that you've done, but just through things that either the hardware itself or the company who runs the iOS for, or the OS for it. Just there's some interesting problems around that, but the people who bought it still feel they don't care about whether it was $3 or $30 or $300 at that point. It was, they spent money on it. It should darn well work forever. It's a tricky thing.
It's sort of that similar argument with do you own video games on Steam or are you just renting them? I mean, as soon as your account's locked out, you suddenly don't have access to these things you spend money on, right? And I think it's sort of a adjacent argument because we're talking about digital rights.
Yeah, but that'd be the same as like saying, your closet full of board games fell over off a cliff and burned down. It's like, if you lose access to your digital version, you don't have them. If you lose access to your physical versions, you also don't have them.
Yeah.
Maybe it's more about the sense of control you have over a physical object in your hand versus something out in the digital sphere.
In the ether.
Yeah, the ether, the nebula. Some of this conversation is around, when we're talking about a VR headset and even Amber, you were talking about Roll20 making the move to create a mobile app. I'd love to hear some thoughts around platforms. If I'm a player and I'm looking to invest in a platform, whether it's financially invest or just, our time is valuable, right? If I'm going to invest in discovering platforms and learning them as makers, as producers, or as players, what are your thoughts on kind of platforms that you think are worth investing in, worth researching? What are your considerations when you are putting your product out there, and what platforms are you taking into account?
I can start here.
Same.
I think that I hadn't really spent too much time thinking about this because I was working on digital, because I was working on apps until I started working at Roll20, which is a browser-based virtual tabletop.
Right.
Most virtual tabletops are not browser-based, and so it has its own unique set of development challenges. But also, we're set up as a subscription as a service model. So I mean, most of our players are free. Everything's free on Roll20 until you start buying pre-prepared modules or you want advanced features. But I think that it's always really interesting when we release things and hearing the conversations and the comments from the community, because you can tell who's developed software before and they're like, oh no, you should pay for this. They're doing a lot of work to actually make this happen and just to sustain it. And then you hear people who have spent thousands of dollars basically building out a digital library of all of their D&D books, and you realize they really are invested in the platform. It's harder for them to move. And I look at some of the there's a lot of emerging platforms. There's a lot of investment in the tabletop space right now, and I think about this a lot because I'm hesitant. I'm sort of risk averse, and I'm hesitant to invest in some of them because I don't think a lot of them are going to be around for very long, right? Like some of them, and it's just hard. It is a little bit of a gamble to see how deep you want to go with some of these different spaces. So I look at their business model. I look at like their, I also care a lot about the way that people support their communities. So I'm always really happy to see that there's actively moderated communities that are inclusive and feel safe, and that they're making sure that they're upholding the value of the publisher's IPs and aren't just sort of, it doesn't become like a Napster situation, which happens a lot. So those are the things that I look at, but I think everyone has their own priorities.
I'll jump in if nobody else does. One of the big things you address is market sizing. So, if you're going to go out and you're like, hey, I'm going to go design Angry Birds. if you're designing Angry Birds and there's 100 iPhones out there, the most you could ever sell would be 100 copies. If there's 1,000,000 iPhones, the most you could ever sell would be 1,000,000 copies. And so as you start looking at putting your time and effort in, like when we did VR, one of our biggest downfalls was VR took off slower than we needed to. So we kind of had the 100 iPhone problem. And so it's always looking at, where's a crowded space versus where's a very uncrowded space, but how many people own a thing and so they can access it. So, there's a lot of people who have access to a PC and a browser. That makes that a fantastic space, but it also limits what you can build into it and how much you can control. So there's a lot of different ways. And, there's, having run a couple of game studios, this is a thing you really look at is the amount of money we have to make this, and then the amount of money we have to market it. Can we get our money back when we do this fairly safely? Because if not, we may not be making any more games. Because, can we make 2 or 3 things that one of them is so good it can pay for the couple more risky ones? And so a lot of it is, if you're an independent designer, you can be like, cool, I know what my risk is. If you're having to pay the salary of 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 people,
Sure.
you get a lot more risk averse because you want to make sure everybody gets paid. We got mouths to feed, health share insurance to get.
As far as platforms to recommend, I would recommend 2, one specifically for game designers and one for board game players. For playing board games, I would recommend Board Game Arena. I found that to be really accessible because they have a free version, and you can make an account and then you can play with anybody. You have the ability to friend people, so you can send them invites to specific games. And then you have access to these games, which what I really enjoy about Board Game Arena is that it enforces the rules. Like people have to code the games in order to put them on there. And so it not only lists the rules and how you play, but it doesn't allow you to accidentally cheat. And it'll kind of outline what you need to do on your turn at the top of the screen, which I think is really nice and just user-friendly. But then as a board game designer, I really support Tabletop Simulator, because while there's a slightly bigger barrier with the cost, it's like $20, but often on sale. But once you go into that, you then have access to this tool, which allows you to iterate over and over again. And then, just play these infinite versions of games. People constantly update with different versions of games that you can then access and play on top of putting together your own game. So I find that one for me, it was the easiest to learn. And there are multiple ways that you can digitally build board games, but I find that once you find one, it's hard to switch between multiple. So the one that I got my burns on was Tabletop Simulator.
You have to sort of learn basically a subset of an entire design language when you pick a system. So I've had that feedback with people who try to use Tabletopia for design work, and they sort of say, well, how do I do this? I can do that on TTS. I'm like, right, but that's not, you do that a different way with us. And so I've also had the opposite feedback where people start with Tabletopia and then suddenly going to TTS and having to export card sheets and upload code, and it's a completely different system. So I totally get that you design what you're comfortable with, and I would recommend for any game designers or publishers that you actually get your game on both, because it's just more exposure for your product. So I definitely think it's worth it if you can do it.
I really this panel is a dream come true to me. We are running a little low on time. So I think if you don't mind, what I'd love to do is just going to go around the table, and I'd love to hear from your perspective, whether it's promoting your current project that's coming out or just something on a broader scale for the industry or for the hobby. What are you looking forward to? What are you excited about? Or what are you hoping to see in kind of the digital analog sphere over the next year or 2 years or 5 years? And, Mark, why don't we just start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I know a lot of people are sort of like hesitant to mix their screens with their paper, but I'm actually a massive fan of hybridization. I especially love games where you can use an app or something digital to enhance your gameplay. So, like, Chronicles of Crime or the Unlock games, those are really fun because an app actually facilitates a lot of the gameplay itself. Also, one that I really liked was Bullet, which recently came out from Level 99 Games, where they had a soundtrack to go with the game, which actually acts as an in-game timer. And it's this custom soundtrack they made, and every song is as long as a round. So you use it as an in-game timer, and it makes you feel really cool while you're playing it. And I really liked using technology to enhance the experience of being around a table with people.
Love that. Fertessa, how about you?
I think the biggest thing I'm looking forward to, besides just continuing these digital conventions and digital playtesting, I really like what I'm seeing with these kind of Steam versions of board games. Like I recently got Wingspan off of Steam on the Switch, and just seeing these digital iterations that still have their own flavor, like they add animations to it, and they have their little touches that make them different, but still allow you to access your game if you're the only person that's able to sit down to them. And usually they need like a higher player count. That to me is really important to allowing you to be able to enjoy these type of games, especially if you don't necessarily enjoy the solo game aspect. I know I'm a bit weird. I'm not into solo games, but I often will play a game as both players. And that just was a weird thing that I started doing as a kid. But I know I'm not the only one out there. And I find that these video game versions of board games really help scratch that itch. So I'm excited to see more board games do that.
Jeff?
I think I'm most excited about seeing, as the pandemic winds down, fingers crossed for everything. I'm excited to see what happens. We've had so many people come into the space over the past year, and suddenly their first time they're seeing things, and now they've been meeting new friends online. They're going to go all start talking to their IRL friends. They're going to start meeting up again. I'm curious to see how this spreads with all these people who found these different digital solutions. Suddenly when they're mixing in person again, what happens? What blows up, what things suddenly take off, how people adapt it. So I love watching, I'm also a technologist. I love watching what happens with the tech. So I'm really curious to see what happens is, when everybody suddenly meets up again and cross-pollinates all the ideas. So I'm excited to see.
Yeah, big, bold future, hopefully.
Yeah.
And to wrap up, Amber, what are your thoughts?
I think that I'll echo what everybody else has said. I think the increased accessibility, increased inclusion, the growth of all of these online communities, and then figuring out the sort of the hybrid model, right? So we hit 5 million accounts like last February, and
Congrats.
now we're
Nice.
closing in on 9 million right now. So in a year, we almost doubled what we had built in 8 years. And so I'm really excited to see what all of those new folks, like there's just a new level of digital literacy. And when you go back to in person, are you taking that map and still using a digital map because you can have lighting effects? Are you just taking your digital character sheet because then you can 1 week play in person and the next week play online? Like I'm just so excited to see what it is that people do, and to see the publishers continue to invest in digital in a different way and see the value, because I think it's helping them up their game as marketers and just as evangelists for the hobby.
Amazing. Folks, thank you so much for your wise and inspiring words. I really appreciate you spending your time here with us and kind of sharing your knowledge and expertise on our panel. So thank you to everyone, Fertessa, Mark, Amber, and Jeff. Really grateful for your time. Of course, hopefully your information on how people can find out about your projects and how they can maybe reach out to you on social media or whatnot will be dropped with the rest of the presentation for D4. So folks out there watching, check these people out. You're looking at brilliant designers, technologists, marketers, people who've put amazing products out there for you. And hopefully this panel has given you a little more insight into the wonderful world of combining the digital and the analog for some really special experiences that are unique in our hobby. Thanks for being here. We hope that you have a wonderful time with the rest of your D4 experience. And until next convention, have fun playing games, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks all.
See ya.
Thanks.